bleeding, purging, and cupping of individuals. And too often I think that we concentrate on that and kind of the, oh, well, you shouldn't have done it this way. And there were other physicians in the city who thought that your manner of treating people was not entirely up to date or deleterious to their health. But when we go through the Benjamin Rush collections at HSP, I felt that a number of things became relatively quickly apparent. And so if you go through his collection and you look at his papers, his publications, you find that you're reading about a man with a very serious and very curious mind. Throughout his medical career, he was an educator in Philadelphia, both of other physicians and of people who were not physicians. Benjamin Rush has a record of, for instance, defending some African-American medical practitioners in Philadelphia. Most of us, I think, are probably somewhat familiar with the heroic role that African-Americans played during the 1793 epidemic. But I think too many people just sort of leave it at the burial of a white citizenry that in large measure didn't care at all about African Americans in the years leading up to the epidemic. But Rush himself works with some African American medical practitioners and lauds them in writing and suggests that they're doing as good a job or better than any lettered and white practitioners with whom he has ever worked. You find that in an era when we have absolutely no idea that life forms or semi-life forms, in the case of a virus, are able to infect the human body and cause disease. And so Benjamin Rush has to be judged when we're reading his papers upon the knowledge base of his time. And in the wake of the 1793 yellow fever epidemic, he is one of many physicians in the city of Philadelphia who are trying to figure out exactly how this disease overwhelmed the city of Philadelphia. It had visited before, but no visitation like the 1793 outbreak. And one of the arguments that he becomes embroiled in is whether it was brought to Philadelphia from somewhere else, or whether it emanated from Philadelphia itself. Looking at things like rotting coffee on the wharf front, and perhaps the vapors, the smells, the miasma that rose from that coffee, perhaps caused disease amongst people and then was carried into interior sections of the city. Benjamin Rush is also very important because he appears just as developed Western medicine is going to go through a transitory phase. And that transitory phase, I think we give a lot of credit to Paris, and we should in the Paris School of Medicine, which is going to, if not revolutionize, then deeply change the way that conventional physicians are going to look at individual patients and how they're going to quantify and understand disease and disease processes, both in an individual patient and in a larger patient population. And so Benjamin Rush is there just at the cusp, in the late 18th century, just at the cusp of this changeover in medicine that Philadelphia is going to be deeply involved in throughout the early and mid 19th century. But Benjamin Rush, for me, also led to field work in Berks County, because a physician like Benjamin Rush in the 18th century is going to be working in close proximity and sometimes collaborating with, at other times, fighting against what we might call today unconventional healers or alternative healers. And they weren't really alternative in the 18th century. Kitchen physic, or the art of medicine as practiced by mothers, wives, and daughters is standard medical care for most people in the 18th century. But we have something else going on in Pennsylvania too. And I like to compare an alternative system of medicine in eastern Pennsylvania, Lancaster, York, Berks, Lehigh counties, and spreading out a bit from there as well, as a system of medicine and religion that is rivaled only by some practices in and around New Orleans. In other words, Pennsylvania doesn't just participate in the practice of unconventional or irregular medicine. We actually have a quantifiable form that is really all our own, and that form is powwowing. Now, I stand apart from a great many semi-scholarly historians who kind of put powwowing in with Native American healing practices. There may have been some of that, but as a serious historian, dates when Native Americans are active in eastern Pennsylvania don't sometimes jibe with our ideas of powwowing. In short, powwowing is a set of medical practices that German immigrants are bringing over in the 1700s to Pennsylvania. And that set of medical practices includes not just the use of herbs and tender loving care, but it's also demanded of participants that you believe in the power specifically of Christ to help heal you, that you believe in the power of the powwow doctor who is healing you. And one of the stories that I was led to investigate through looking at Benjamin Rush and trying to get a better understanding of the milieu in which he worked is of a woman named Mary Younger. Her German name was probably Marie Younger with a J. And in Berks County, in the Ole Hills, she is known as Mountain Mary. And so working in the stacks at HSP led to this photograph that my wife took of these two very nice cows in a farmstead on top of a mountain in Berks County, Pennsylvania. And I decided, well, if I want to understand colonial medicine, because that's not where I concentrate my work is late 19th and early 20th centuries, then I should go out and see what I can see with respect to how these powwowers operate. Well, it's almost impossible. They're a closed community. It's very hard to track down the names of living powwowers. But I was able to investigate with the kindness of the couple that now live on her farm, this extraordinary woman who came to Philadelphia, probably in the 1750s, may have then moved into Germantown, but certainly moved from Philadelphia into the Ole Hills. And her small farmstead exists. Mountain Mary, as she's known by just about everybody in the region, lived for about 40 years with a sister and a mother, and then by herself, and was noted for her ability to heal the small population of people that lived outside of Reading, Pennsylvania. Mountain Mary always kept ties, it appears, however, to Philadelphia. She produced her own cheese and honey, and every couple of months, she had an arrangement, it appears, with a couple of other farmers, and they would take her produce to market in Philadelphia. And she seems to have gone to Philadelphia as well, perhaps also to practice medicine. Mountain Mary is an atypical, irregular healer in Eastern PA, in that the moniker powwower doesn't really apply to her. And naysayers and folklorists aside, she doesn't fit neatly into this kind of powwow definition. It wasn't passed down to her that we can tell. She is a strong, independent woman. In fact, in the first census, she is noted as Mary, the Abbess. The Abbess certainly having a religious connotation and perhaps pointing us to a congregation, a loose congregation that she may have led. She was literate, had a library full of books when she died in 1819, and had an estate that today would be valued at several tens of thousands of dollars, not including her land, her house, and her outbuildings. Mountain Mary was, if we look at it through the eyes, I think, of a modern historian, she was a nurse. She was a visiting nurse in the best tradition of visiting nurses. A network of trails, some of which still exist, kind of spiderweb out from the mountaintop where her house is, and they lead down into the valleys where the farmers are. And she would, attend people day and night for days on end, probably accepted some sort of recompense for it, but was noted as somebody who you could call on if you were poor and your children or your wife was sick. This woman would come and try to take care of you. And Mountain Mary then typifies the sort of person that Benjamin Rush and other early physicians like Father and Son Shippen would have encountered in their rounds to their Philadelphia patients. In fact, you may have someone like a Benjamin Rush and a kitchen physic healer in the same room, consulting with one another, trying to figure out what the best course of action would be. Mountain Mary also has a pull on people in this region. So this slide that you see is a photograph we took of her gravesite. And we think we're looking at head and foot stones, probably 3 people buried in this little burial ground. But as of a few years ago, this burial ground, the walls were really crumbled down. And the owners tried to get an older Pennsylvania Dutch stonemason in to fix the wall. And unbeknownst to him, they were going to see how well he did in fixing up the wall, and they were going to give him contracts to do work on some of the other buildings. And he kept putting the homeowners off. And he kept putting them off until one of them called and said, "We need this wall fixed, thumbs up or thumbs down. Are you going to come?" And he was very reticent about doing anything around the grave of Mountain Mary. His belief, though many would characterize it as superstition, but his belief ran so deep, and the legend of Mountain Mary was so well known, and it was really taken as fact that this woman was not just a health provider, but transgressed the boundaries of the physical world, and the seat of much of her power, according to many people at the time, was something supernatural. Right, so she's Hexenrai, a witch. And this stonemason, very old, didn't want to anger, as he put it, Mountain Mary's spirit. He finally did the wall, but this is the kind of pull that Mountain Mary had and has on some people. But when we compare a Benjamin Rush and a Mountain Mary leaves behind essentially no written records whatsoever, besides the one notation in the census record, and then some possible firsthand accounts of people meeting her in the early 19th century. While Benjamin Rush, on the other hand, at HSP, has devoted tens of thousands of words to his practice. But when we get into the records of HSP, when we get into the records of physicians and the records of dispensaries and hospitals that are existent in the 18th century, the early 19th century, that are held by HSP, I think we get a clear understanding of why in the 18th and early 19th century people would be willing, would even prefer somebody like Mary Younger over someone like a Benjamin Rush. Rush and his fellow conventionally trained physicians, many of them by the middle and end of the 18th century are coming out of University of Edinburgh, are using measures that, even if people weren't cognizant of the negative consequences that they might have on a course of disease, a lot of these measures were very, very painful, very uncomfortable. And so bleeding, which by the end of the 19th century is just starting to come out of fashion. The use of purgatives, even if you have a gastrointestinal upset, and that's why you've gone to the doctor. Well, the first thing that somebody like a Benjamin Rush is probably going to offer you will be some combination of Indian physic, which is ipecac, to induce just projectile, powerful vomiting until your stomach is completely empty. And he may prescribe something like a calomel, which will completely void your bowels. And this is on top of gastrointestinal upset to begin with. The use of mustards, plasters that will raise a blister on your skin, thought to bring toxin, thought to bring poison out of the skin, is nothing less than a minor to moderate chemical burn on the upper one or two layers of your skin. People like Mountain Mary generally trafficked in a much more gentle form of medicine. And so the use of herbs, tinctures, teas, rest, keeping you dry. If there is incontinence, then keeping your bed linens and your clothing clean, making sure that you're eating a nourishing meal, making sure that you're warm. None of these things are going to hurt your health outcome, but they may very well help you. While much of the stuff that an 18th century physician is going to do, at best, is going to not make you sicker. It's not going to make your condition worse. But much of what they do will make your condition far worse and may actually bring upon your death. If we look at the way George Washington meets his end in November, December 1799, 30 to 40 ounces of blood taken out of his body at his insistence over the course of a week's illness. And so I think most medical doctors, when they look at the death of George Washington, it is, no matter what the seat of the infection in his throat, whether we see this as an epiglottal infection or diphtheria, hemorrhaging is also a contributory cause to his death and the deaths of many people. Dehydration, exhaustion brought about by purging that can go on day after day after day. And so someone like Mountain Mary, someone like the powwowers, the alternative, as we call it today, medical providers in the 18th and early 19th century, were preferred probably because they caused you less pain, probably because you weren't as uncomfortable with the treatments that many of them offered. And it's important to have the written material from physicians like Benjamin Rush to use to compare to the composite that we build of people in more rural areas of Pennsylvania or non-traditional practitioners in the city of Philadelphia itself. Another physician, this time in the mid to late 19th century, who kept coming up in files at HSP, and HSP almost forced me because it whetted my appetite for understanding a little bit about Dr. Benjamin Lee. But I really had to go rather far afield to understand exactly what he was fighting in the state of Pennsylvania. So Benjamin Lee is a Philadelphia physician, and he is, without any rival, the most consistent proponent of public health and public health organizations at both the local and the state level in 19th century Pennsylvania. Benjamin Lee is a devout Christian, and much of his writing kind of intersects the cleanliness being next to godliness. And so a well-ordered, hygienic society is a society that reflects what God wants for his people and how people should be acting, taking care of themselves and taking care of others. His 10-year period between the middle of the 1870s to the middle of the 1880s must have just been absolutely frustrating for this man. He is in Harrisburg. He is trying to get some political weight behind a state public health board, and he's just finding absolutely no traction whatsoever in Pennsylvania's legislature. And he only has to look north to Massachusetts and to New York State, especially Massachusetts, to know that state public health organizations can be created and they can have a positive effect on a state's population. In 1882, Robert Koch in Germany announces that he has found the causative organism for tuberculosis. Now, we have work by Pasteur and by Lister in the 1860s and 70s that starts pointing to a microbial influence on disease. And in fact, anthrax in sheep is the first bacteria that Koch works on. And Pasteur derives a vaccination, inoculation for sheep. But when we're looking at the causative organism and a disease in human beings, Robert Koch makes that announcement in March of 1882. And generally speaking, we set the clock, the stopwatch for when humanity, when science finally understands that microbes are absolutely causing a quantifiable disease in people, as March of 1882. And over the 1880s and the early 1890s, scientists are able to discover the causative organisms, the causative microbes for a host of bacterial diseases, and they're getting more and more proof that viruses exist. You're not going to be able to see them. Some scientists and physicians in their own research say, look, this is probably a toxin from bacteria that we're not able to screen out of our porcelain filters, but they're headed down the road to understanding that there are entities even smaller than bacteria that also cause infections in people. And yet there is absolutely no movement in the legislature for a public health board. When I was a student at Lehigh, during my PhD studies, every once in a while in a monograph that concerned industrial history, labor history, some form of social history, whether it was concentrating in Pennsylvania or elsewhere, Plymouth, Pennsylvania would come up. And it would generally just be a sentence and maybe a footnote, and then the author would move on. And that footnote is much more than just a footnote. And HSP helped send me into the field on and off again for a couple of years, trying to figure out what happened at Plymouth. And so for those of you who aren't familiar, Plymouth is up in Luzerne County. It's a small post-industrial, post-coal mine town perched just above the Susquehanna River. And In 1884, a man from Plymouth, last name of Jones, goes to visit his brother in Philadelphia. And his brother's in a boarding house in Philadelphia that has had sporadic cases of typhoid. Well, Mr. Jones comes back to his house in Plymouth in early 1885 and develops typhoid. Now, the thing about this man Jones and how his life intersects with this Philadelphia public health advocate is that Jones owns a hardscrabble dairy farm, just a half a dozen or so cows, some chickens, and his home with his wife and a few kids is alongside an absolutely nondescript stream called Coal Creek, and you won't find it on most maps. If you go to Plymouth today, and HSP sent me scrambling out to Plymouth, Pennsylvania, what you'll find when you look up the mountain is trees as far as you can see from the town. And so I had to walk up this stream through very dense brush. The place has been overgrown for about 40 years now. 40 years because a few years before Mr. Jones became ill, the Plymouth Water Company took Coal Creek and placed 4 dams on the creek, on the stream. And the stream itself is only 2 to 3 feet wide. It's a very small mountain stream. And behind each one of these dams was a pond. And finally at the dam number 1, which is the lowest down the mountain, there was a pipe that took this water to the citizens of Plymouth. Well, Mr. Jones is sitting at the side of this stream, and the stream is clear and cold, but by February, he is racked with typhoid. And a nurse comes to take care of him. Typhoid is generally a waterborne illness. If you get, and every year you get a few dozen cases of it in the US, it is usually because of improper food handling. And it's caused by Salmonella typhi, so a bacteria in the Salmonella family. It's not characterized by diarrhea and much stomach upset like most GI bugs, but rather by bloating of the abdomen, cramping, constipation, and if there is diarrhea, it is in relatively small quantities. This fever without antibiotic intervention tends to last 3 to 5 weeks. People lose a great deal of weight, and they generally succumb to either the fever itself wearing them down, or what we call typhoid pneumonia, when through lymph action, the bacteria are carried into the lungs and set up a fulminant, a pulmonary infection, or through a hemorrhage of the intestines. So I've got it's almost a treasure map. You know, a 10-year-old could have drawn it, a very rough map that was drawn by investigators who went up to take a look at this illness. And at this point, the only people who are going to investigate an illness are either your local doctors, or in the case of Plymouth, several doctors from Philadelphia. Benjamin Lee has a hand in this, who come up and try to treat people and to relieve the situation. What happened was Jones's nurse was taking his fecal matter and throwing it on the snow next to the creek. He also had an outhouse that was filled almost to the brim. And when in late March, early April, the thaw comes in that part of Pennsylvania, all this fluent matter runs into the creek, runs down to the last pond, and then is piped into the water faucets of people who could afford it in the town. Most of you are familiar with the term Typhoid Mary, Mary Mallon, the Irish cook who was investigated for spreading typhoid and then spends most of the rest of her life on an island off Manhattan, isolated away from the rest of the world. And though, you know, looking at Typhoid Mary brings up a number of different arguments and debates about the nature of immigrants and the nature of women in early 19th or early 20th century America. Jones, what he inadvertently did and what his nurse did was far worse. The epidemic rages for about 3 months, and when it's done, in this town of 8,000, we have 1,100 plus people that we absolutely diagnosed with typhoid. Well over 100 are killed. And if you do the investigative work that should be done, and you take your investigation outside of Plymouth to places like Kingston, which is right next door, you see that there is a rise in infections as well and deaths from typhoid. Many of these people are connected to Plymouth somehow. They either have business there, they go to market there, they have friends or family there. And so I went on this journey up the stream bed and through the brambles and thickets, finally up to this large grassy mossy area, and that was the big fourth pond. And Mr. Jones's house was between dam 3 and dam 4. And I'm looking around, I'm thinking I'm seeing the results of human occupation, although it's grown over. And I went down, looked in the archives a bit more, also looked in the newspapers from Plymouth. And what we have is Mr. Jones being informed of his typhoid positivity. And what I think occurred is that he becomes an asymptomatic carrier, like Mary Mallon, because in an area of Pennsylvania where typhoid death rates are pretty high anyway, Plymouth sticks out for the next 10 years. For the next 10 years, Plymouth has a typhoid death rate that is extraordinary compared to nearby coal towns. And it seems that the people who are getting sick are mostly the people who are connected to the town's water supply, not the people who are bringing up water from their own private wells. The real impetus for the founding in 1886 of Pennsylvania's first state-level public health organization, the Pennsylvania State Board of Health, is the Plymouth typhoid outbreak. Newspapers and gazettes and magazines across the Western world carry news about the Plymouth outbreak. And they take the investigation that Wilkes-Barre and Plymouth and Philadelphia doctors do, and they publicize it. And they say this entire town has gotten sick because of one man and one man only putting his contaminated feces into the water supply. Jones is informed of this. And for the next decade, he, his family, and his little farm remain right there at the side of this water course. And so over the last couple of years, I decided to go up in wintertime. And I went up with a young man, 15 years old, who was interested in history and wanted to accompany me. And he's 15, I'm 43, 44 when I was doing this. He is much more able, or maybe I'm much more willing to send him into areas of this forest that maybe have a bit more poison ivy and thickets. And he's happy and willing to do it. And as I'm standing there trying to figure out whether this depression I'm standing in is part of foundation, and it's January, it's freezing cold, year and a half ago, I see a crevice underneath a rock that's about half the size of a dinner table. And I told him, well, let's see if we can pull this back. It's frosted down because it was so cold, and we pull it back. And I couldn't believe what I was staring at. I took my measuring tape and I measured from about the stream bank, because it's on an embankment, back to this obviously human dug hole. And at first I thought, well, I might be looking at a well hole here. It looks very much like a well hole. But the state gave me the measurements for how far back this man's outhouse was. and about the size of the outhouse, and that it was a stone-lined outhouse hole. The measurements matched up, and so did the description of the outhouse hole. And I'm looking, and this is the photograph of the stone pulled back into what I think is the outhouse hole of Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones becomes a hated figure in Plymouth, and Benjamin Lee of Philadelphia can't believe that this guy is still living in Plymouth doing the exact same thing, when at this point Benjamin Lee, longtime secretary, which essentially means he runs the operation of the Board of Health. There's a president who rotates every year, but Benjamin Lee for 19 years is the secretary of the Board of Health. He is the one person that maintains continuity. And he sends an investigator up in 1895. And he says, I want you to check on this guy Jones and see what's going on, see if there's any improvement in the conditions. And the investigator that he sends up tells Benjamin Lee, not only is that farm still there, but when I got to this house through a road that doesn't exist anymore, he was coming back with his wife from the funeral of his 12-year-old son who had just died of typhoid. And a few months before, a man who worked on that farm had to be sent to the hospital in Wilkes-Barre because he caught typhoid. There's nobody living above these people. This is the last stop this is the first stop. This is the issuance of Coal Creek. There's nobody on this watershed. It's just him. And so there is a record of typhoid in his family and down to his town. And finally, the newspapers, in some ways at the urging of Benjamin Lee, start taking a harder line. And the Board of Health of the state of Pennsylvania through Benjamin Lee says something that you couldn't get away with today, but he says, perhaps it's going to take the citizens of Plymouth to remedy this situation by pulling down this house. And before that can happen, the city of Plymouth pulls him into court, and the waterworks, Plymouth Water Company, buys his farm. And there's a record through Benjamin Lee of this farm being pulled down. And I actually have some implements that I found that are undergoing scanning electron microscopy at Lehigh University to kind of determine the time period when some of these iron implements might have been manufactured. Just because I want the full story of Plymouth, not only for my own edification, but to explore this story for other people interested in history by writing the full story of this tale, which for me begins with a couple of oblique mentions in books as I'm a grad student, and by looking through Benjamin Lee's records and the records of physicians around that period at HSP. And it's this outhouse hole and that stream and Benjamin Lee that kick off state level public health in Pennsylvania. To Benjamin Lee's great consternation, the Board of Health is empowered with no ability to regulate, no ability to punish. And so they educate and they proselytize and they consult on epidemics, but they have no power to order a city or a township to do or to not do something to avoid or to treat an epidemic outbreak. It's going to take another epidemic, and this one in 1903 out in Butler, Pennsylvania, again, a typhoid epidemic in a town, a steel town this time, on the Ohio River. And if anything, the Butler epidemic embarrasses Pennsylvania even more. And so we turn to our final major personage at HSP and the papers of Samuel Gibson Dixon. There are other Philadelphians involved, especially Charles Lee, Dr. Charles Penrose, a noted gynecologist, obstetrician from a very wealthy Philadelphia family, who in large measure writes the public health laws for Pennsylvania in 1905. and brings the Pennsylvania Department of Health into being. Samuel Dixon, his entire collection of papers is at HSP. The one regret is that if he had many personal papers, his family either chose not to give them to HSP. I think in the 1940s, the papers were donated, or he himself destroyed them. I believe personal papers and an extensive personal paper collection existed at one time, just because of who Samuel Dixon was, and how he wrote and how he educated. Samuel Dixon is of old Quaker stock. And for those of you who know the city of Philadelphia well, you're familiar, of course, on the west side of the Schuylkill River with Bartram's Gardens. Now, just south of Bartram's Gardens was the Gibson-Dixon estate, and that had been held by the Gibson and Dixon families since the early 1700s. Samuel's father is, if not the leading, one of the leading jewelers in Philadelphia in the 19th century. And I'd like to say that Dixon, the family name wasn't as august perhaps as the Biddles, but it was as respected in elite social circles. And in fact, many of the Gibson-Dixon family will marry into the Drexel family and the Biddle family, Wanamakers, et cetera, et cetera. Samuel Dixon earns his law degree at the University of Pennsylvania in the mid-1870s, practices law with his brother, Edwin, and then Edwin becomes a very powerful business and real estate attorney in Philadelphia, but suffers a bout of ill health. The ill health itself is difficult to quantify. He had one bout in the early 1870s that sends him off to Europe. He had dreamed of Harvard and instead goes to eventually University of Pennsylvania School of Law. This bout of ill health doesn't send him off to Europe, and I can't tell you whether it was physical or psychological. What I can tell you is that at the end of it, after about a year of illness, rest, recuperation, he decides to pursue his medical degree at the University of Pennsylvania as well. And he enters the med school in 1883. The medical school, in all deference to the brilliant people who teach there today, this is a moment in time, a decade and a half long period, where the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine has leading lights of a known international level. So the most well-known, of course, is William Osler, who becomes one of the founders of Johns Hopkins University and Johns Hopkins School of Medicine and Hospital, and then spends the last decades of his career as a physician and professor at Oxford. We have William Pepper, Lady is there. So we have really towering figures at the University of Pennsylvania when he goes and completes his degree there in the 1880s. And in 1886, he completes his degree and then immediately gets on a ship and goes to England because he's sick. And this time he is sick with typhoid. He manages to pull through, and he had already been noted as a researcher, as a student. And in part, he's a married father of one when he's a medical student. He's in his 30s. He has the time, I think, and the inclination to devote to it. And they make him dean of the Auxiliary School of Medicine. And the Auxiliary School of Medicine is concerned with public health. And he is then charged with by the university with setting up what you can argue is the first hygiene lab in the United States. And he is not satisfied with teaching students what he is learning from other professors. So he goes back over to Europe to do research himself. And in 1889, in a laboratory in England, Cruikshank's laboratory, he looks through a microscope and he sees something that scientists have been hunting for since 1882. Scientists know that you can take bacteria, and when you subject them to deleterious environmental conditions, the bacteria may attenuate to survive. And so they may change shape, they may bud. And this manipulation, this weakening of the bacteria is really the way that Pasteur came up with his anthrax vaccination. Weaken the bacteria, and then you can use them to alert the immune system to future infection. Well, no one's been able to do this, including Robert Koch. Dixon looks through a microscope and he sees what he calls the branched forms of tuberculosis, Mycobacterium tuberculosis. And what that means is they budded these branches out on them. And he doesn't tell anyone. What he had done was taken a test tube from an incubator that was in the sunlight, and the incubator itself wasn't used for its proper purposes. Students in the lab had used the incubator to raise the temperature of some test tubes, dishes, and to keep some instruments warm, not to attenuate bacteria. So he keeps this to himself and thinks, well, I think I figured this out. He manipulates the bacteria for the next few days until he's sure that he can induce these changes himself. And then he has Cruikshank come over and take a look in his microscope. And then he has students do it. The students are telling him, you messed this up. What you're really seeing are tuberculosis bacteria laying on top of one another, and you're mistaking the ends jutting out for actually being a changed form of tuberculosis. But the master at the lab, Cruikshank, says, no, absolutely not. He says to Dixon, if this is true, you've made a great scientific discovery. Well, Dixon returns back to Philadelphia and wants to do nothing but tuberculosis research in his hygiene lab. And the hygiene lab, he didn't like the equipment there. And so he went out and purchased all of it for the University of Pennsylvania. Something happens. And within a few months of coming back to Philadelphia and the University of Pennsylvania, he decides to leave his deanship at the University of Pennsylvania, take all of his equipment and take it over to the Academy of Natural Sciences. Now, the Academy of Natural Sciences in 1889, 1890 had seen its best days. It was still respected, but it had lost ground, as a lot of medical institutions had lost ground in Philadelphia to New York and to Boston. But he takes a chance on it anyway. And I suspect through reading his papers at HSP that a few things are happening. One, he alludes in letters to administrators many years later at University of Pennsylvania that he's been in a long-running fight with somebody in the med school there. And that is not mentioned in any official documents that you could find at the University of Penn. This is in handwritten letters that Dixon sends to a friend of his at the university. And so it seems like there was bad blood there. If you are just reading about Dixon from the perspective of other historians who are concentrating on his time as Commissioner of Health, then you miss that. You don't get that sense of Dixon because everything just kind of seems to bend to his touch. You don't really get a sense that he's ever lost an administrative fight in his life. And yet there he is admitting to it. And he spends all of 1890 working on nothing but the tuberculosis bacteria at the Academy of Natural Sciences. So first he's able to attenuate it, and then he pulls a solution. He compounds a solution from the attenuated bacterial masses. And first he starts shooting a solution into guinea pigs. Hundreds of them. And then after he inoculates them with that, he hits them with virulent strains of the bacteria. And what he finds in the guinea pigs that are normally pretty susceptible is that they are showing no signs of infection at all, or he has slowed the infection down. He turns his huge house, the ancestral estate, out across the Schuylkill River into one large lab. And when he takes reporters there in late 1890, they see everything from guinea pigs to chickens. There's a cow, a couple of monkeys, and a number of other species that he has hit with attenuated bacteria, and then a solution derived from it, and then the bacteria itself. So if we kind of look at the process of what he's going for, and there's no doubt in my mind from his writing that he is going for a cure for TB. Okay. The first thing you have to do is attenuate the bacteria in his mind. The second thing you have to do is provoke immunity in laboratory animals, and you have to do it over and over and over again before you inject it into people. When he wrote his first article about the attenuated tubercle bacteria, he publishes it, and it's his mistake, in a very minor medical journal in Philadelphia. To his credit, he also takes this article and mails it to Robert Koch. Koch understands, he knows that Dixon has attenuated this bacteria. And he gets started right away on his work, but he doesn't tell anybody. And in fact, when we look at how German historians of science have characterized Koch's research, it becomes pretty clear that Koch is worried. And so German historians and other historians are the first to say he went from attenuating bacteria to developing something that he calls tuberculin. But tuberculin, almost everybody listening to this has had contact with tuberculin. It's the solution that is put under your skin when you're doing a TB test. But that's not what it was originally designed for. Koch saw it as a cure for tuberculosis. And so in August of 1890, Dixon and a few of his colleagues are flabbergasted when they find out that at the International Medical Congress in Berlin, Koch has announced that he has attenuated Mycobacterium tuberculosis, and he's the first to do it, he says. He has induced immunity in guinea pigs, and he's the first to do it. And now he has a cure for tuberculosis in humans. What we find is that tuberculin is an extract that Koch cannot decipher because he's not a chemist. The human trials, as we would call them today, consisted of injecting tuberculin into two people, himself and his 17-year-old girlfriend. And then he releases tuberculin for use by physicians in Berlin. Dixon is immediately taken up by Koch's announcements and begins to remind people that he's the one who hit the first two milestones, attenuation and immunity in animals, first. He's the only American physician that newspapers in New York and London and Philadelphia follow when, under the auspices of Jefferson University's College of Medicine, he gets on a passenger ship in November of 1890 and sails for Hamburg. When he gets there, he is seeking a meeting with Dixon, with Koch, and Koch won't meet him. Koch, in late November, early December, is starting to feel the pressure from the German government that underwrote his research, and from some physicians who are starting to think that maybe tuberculin isn't the panacea that Koch thinks it is. In order to meet with Koch, Dixon has to go through the U.S. diplomatic corps in Germany, and he has to release two statements. One, that he does not have a cure for tuberculosis, and two, that he is attempting to take no glory away from the great Robert Koch. Berlin was Dixon's worst nightmare in terms of unfettered experimentation on people. Over and over and over again in the fall and early winter of 1890, when Dixon was pressed, why haven't you tested your solution on people? His response is, doctors in Philadelphia know that I have this treatment. They're sending patients down to the academy to ask me to inject them, but I can't do it yet because I don't know what's going to happen to the people I inject this with. And even if it is harmless, being harmless is not actually harmless in this context, because I don't want to give hope to humanity that I've got the cure for tuberculosis only to disappoint everyone. Well, in Berlin, we have physicians coming in from all over Germany. They're picking up packages of tuberculin. They're doing no research of their own, and they're going back to their towns. Now, we know a handful of anaphylactic reactions to tuberculin that kill people. But what Dixon we'll see in Berlin is horrifying. Every good hotel is taken by physicians from out of town who are trying to get their hands on this stuff. He finally gets a meeting with Koch, and he says, he's a very nice man, and all he really wanted to know was whether or not I had a cure for human tuberculosis, and I told him I did not. Koch has already got a scheme together whereby he is going to produce tuberculin and split the proceeds to the tune of millions of marks a year with the German government. But Dixon goes around with a German physician, an anatomist named Virchow. And Virchow is probably the best pathologist in the world. In 1890. What Virchow is seeing is reactivation of old tubercular lesions in people when they're hit with tuberculin. And it's Virchow that puts the final nails in the coffin for tuberculin and really for Koch. He's never looked at the same after this. And he says, this is actually killing people. You're giving this to people who have tubercular meningitis, and we're watching the infection run away. We're watching people with a seemingly slow progressing infection of tuberculosis, pulmonary tuberculosis, and just a few weeks later, they're on death's door. And if it's happening in Berlin with these series of autopsies I'm doing, it is guaranteed to be happening beyond Berlin. Dixon comes back to Pennsylvania and makes an announcement that he's seen tuberculin. It may be useful in some cases. He even ventures a guess and says, I think it's an extract of attenuated tuberculosis bacteria with some kind of salt. And he says it's probably a gold salt. And so he's not off by much. That's basically the formulation of tuberculin when German chemists, academic chemists, are able to crack the code of what exactly this thing is, this extract is, this miracle cure is. But tuberculin and Dixon's fluid, which he just calls the fluid of Dixon, is tried on tuberculosis patients for the next 25 years in experiments attempting to prove tuberculosis, to cure tuberculosis. Tuberculin becomes a diagnostic tool, but Dixon never gives up hope on finding a cure for tuberculosis. And he has a series of handwritten letters that go back and forth with another very famous German physician. And the originals are at HSP, written in English. And these two physicians, these two scientists, are really discussing the epitaph of one of the most important bacteriologists, Robert Koch, in all of history. And they say, he shouldn't be destroyed. His reputation shouldn't be destroyed over tuberculin. But he has walked himself out on a limb that he cannot come back from. Dixon being Dixon, is very charitable, and never lodges a kind of formal protest in the scientific press that his priority for the discovery of attenuated tubercle bacteria and induced immunity in laboratory animals has been taken from him by Robert Koch, although it was. Dixon spends the next 15 years as first curator and then president of the Academy of Natural Sciences before he is tapped to become the first commissioner of health of the state of Pennsylvania. I think most of us who know the history of Pennsylvania medicine, when you know Dixon, you probably connect it most with Barbara Bates's book on tuberculosis treatment in Pennsylvania, Bargaining for Health, which is one of my favorite histories of medicine. But I think we concentrate too much on his sanatoria, Hamburg, Mont Alto, and Cresson in Pennsylvania, all of which, if you're willing to do a little legwork, you can go and see. Those kind of three field places where I do work, I have no problem sharing with people. I kind of keep where the Plymouth homestead is a little bit vague, and most people don't want to have to go through what you have to go through to get to this place. But you can see the sanatoria because they've all were repurposed at one time or another as group homes or prisons. And so I think we most connect Dixon with this very expensive and ultimately total failure in terms of curing tuberculosis in the sanatoria. But I argue that Dixon is far more important than just the three sanatoria. And one of the very few places where anybody is going to see the Dixon that existed beyond the sanatoria, the Dixon as the husband, the father, one of the founders of the American Kennel Club, a researcher and public health protector until the day he dies doing his work in a hospital bed in February of 1918. It is at HSP that I'm able to see photographs of this towering figure in Pennsylvania public health. But I think if we give it just a bit of time and a bit more research and a bit more publishing about Dixon, we're going to see him as a very important national and international figure of public health. I get to see him in 1853, just a couple of years after he's born. I get to see him as a teenager and a person in his 20s, and I get to see pictures of his wife and his one child, Catherine. And if you don't have HSP, and if you don't go through these files meticulously, then you miss this other side of this man who was characterized by one of his closest colleagues as ruggedly honest and as gentle as a woman. And when we see the photographs or we read some of the very few private correspondences that Dixon has, and they exist nowhere, as far as I can tell, outside of HSP, we get an entirely different figure of Dixon. He is not just the administrator of these sanatoria that couldn't cure a disease that was not curable until the advent of antibiotics. We also look at a man who, a few days before the 4th of July, every single year between 1905 and 1917, put in warnings telling parents, don't allow your kids to play with firecrackers. If it goes off, tetanus is a danger. And oh, by the way, under my orders, we've set up a tetanus antitoxin dispensary in all 67 counties of the state. We've set up diphtheria antitoxin dispensaries, 110 of them. Many of our counties have 2 dispensary points so that poor people, for free, can survive. Their kids can survive a disease that routinely has a 30% case fatality rate. He worked himself to the bone and had very little time for family. When he went on vacation, it was to Islesboro, Maine, a place where just a few days ago in the news, we found out that John Travolta was selling his house. And it's one of the few places where he was able to have fun with his family. Dixon is a breeder of dogs, and my favorite photograph of this man is of him kneeling in his vest and his starched white collar in front of this dog, and behind it is his daughter, maybe 10 years old, 11 years old, and she's got the dog's tail and is stretching it out, and they're posing the dog. Otherwise, Catherine Dixon, who goes on to be a philanthropist and passes away in the 1970s, you don't know very much about her, and you don't see this relationship between this hard-bitten man of science, this medical doctor, this man who really went into what we call today hot zones. And I remind all of you that dealing with infectious disease 100, 120 years ago without plastics, without shatterproof glass, without modern sterilization equipment, was a daunting task. And he lost people. And it weighs heavily on him. So without HSP, if you want to track down sources from different archives and online, you can get a good story. You can get a good understanding of Dixon. But with HSP, you begin to understand Dixon, the man, Dixon, the scientist who loves his family, Dixon, the man who takes numerous photographs and writes about Black Rock Farm in Bryn Mawr, an old farm that he purchased and then rebuilt into a country estate over the course of half a decade. And that is, for me, where HSP comes really to the fore in my mind when I want to know about the history of medicine in Pennsylvania. It's not the official documents. It's what I can learn about the human beings behind those documents. And so HSP forms a cornerstone of my research and has since about 2005. HSP, I have no doubt, is also going to form a cornerstone of people who want to understand the current outbreak that we're living through, the current epidemic we're living through in 100 years. Either going to HSP wherever it exists in the archives digitally, it is a resource that is almost boundless. And the final thing I'll say, and I think it's the best compliment that I could ever give to HSP in terms of its collection on disease and medicine and public health, is that those collections are sitting there waiting to have master's theses and dissertations and articles and monographs written solely from the material there. It is perhaps the single best starting point for history of medicine in our state, because it is not interested in just a single time period or just one particular form or type of medicine or one person. It runs the gamut from the late 17th century through the 20th century. And I think as archives go, that is the absolutely best compliment that you could pay them, that you have untold numbers of publications just waiting to be written based upon what is in your stacks. So I hope everyone enjoyed this. I'm happy to answer any questions that I can. Thank you all very much for this honor.
Great. Thank you, Jim. That was really good. That was really interesting. And a lot of good detailed history stuff that I had never heard of before, which is, I mean, I'm a student of Pennsylvania medicine, but just things I learned a lot tonight. So that was really great. Thank you.
Thank you.
And just to piggyback real quick, before we do have some questions, and I do want to say, if you would like to submit any questions, at the bottom of the screen is a Q&A icon. Just click on that and you can type in a question, and we'll do our best to answer it. But I do want to say we are in the midst of this pandemic, we are wanting to hear from everybody and collecting stories. So on our website, you can find out more information, or you can email us at pandemic@hsp.org. I'll put that in the chat too, in case you have a story or artwork or something you want to share with us. We would love for you to share that with us. That'd be great. And it looks like our first question is about homeopathic medicine. They said, did you come across records of homeopathic doctors? They mentioned there are many from Germany in the 1800s.
Yeah. So in my research for the first book, Health in the Commonwealth, Allentown, where I live, is actually have this hotbed of homeopathy in the 1830s and 1840s. And we argue that in Northampton and Lehigh counties and in Allentown, really the first institutions of homeopathic medicine in the United States were developed. So much so that two people from Allentown then go down and help found Hahnemann, the great homeopathic institution there. I think it's important. So to know a little bit about me, I worked at a natural food and homeopathic, naturopathic medicine store for about a decade when I was in college and in grad school. And so homeopathic is not a synonym for natural medicine. And so for the homeopathic physician of 150, 170 years ago, it's the notion that something that causes the symptoms that you're having can be given to you in minute doses to fight those symptoms. So yes, the short answer is yes, especially with Dixon, I come across material relating to homeopathy. What you have to understand is that with Dixon, it is a tooth and nail fight against it. And so Pennsylvania has several boards, licensing boards set up for, you've got a licensing board for midwife, you've got a licensing board set up for homeopathic medicine, one for conventional medicine. And the argument from Dixon and his colleagues is, look, these people who are coming from their own schools of medical thought, homeopathy, water cure, the eclectic school, their claim is that they know more than conventional doctors. Now, I put homeopathic and water cure doctors into kind of the same vein that I put powwow doctors or kitchen physic right through the early 19th century, right? They're probably not going to do any worse than a conventional doctor is going to do, and they won't inflict as much pain. The problem is after the 1840s and 50s, water cure doctors are saying, water cure, water cure, water cure. Whether you have smallpox or you have a headache, we've got the water cure for you. Homeopathic physicians are saying the same thing. As science, as conventional medicine is producing things like general anesthetic, they're producing things under Lister like a more sterile field for surgery, and the washing of hands, the non-use of aprons from one surgical theater to another. And so as conventional science, medical science is progressing, you're still hearing water cure, water cure, water cure, homeopathy, homeopathy, homeopathy. You're seeing better outcomes from conventional medicine. And so when you're looking at Dixon, yes. I haven't, while at HSP, because of what I'm looking at and you know, specifically what I'm going in to do at the time I have, I'm not chalking down homeopathic medicine to any great detail. I'm kind of filling in blanks with it in the narratives that I'm trying to create. But yes, it's there. I've run across it. I just haven't spent much time with it. And if you're looking at people like Dixon or Lee, they're going to have, you know, kind of a hate-hate relationship with homeopathy and unconventional medicine, because they're also going into, you know, even osteopathy, which is not osteopathy today. Osteopathy of 130 years ago, 140 years ago, bears zero resemblance to the medicine that is taught and practiced by osteopaths today. And so even with osteopaths, there is a lot of infighting that's taking place in the medical community. So it's there. You have to hunt for it, but it's there in the stacks. Certainly, it's there in the stacks.
Great.
All right.
Thank you. And we got another question that they wanted to know this is a terrific presentation, and how did Dixon die in 1918?
So Dixon, it's for me, it's a sad story. Dixon is charting through 1914 the extraordinary I mean, even if we leave aside the fact that tuberculosis rates and mortality rates are going down in the state, the death rates of tuberculosis in the sanatoria don't go down, because once your infection is activated, nothing in the world is going to help you besides antibiotics. Every person with an active tuberculosis infection is going to die. But what he's able to do is tell the public, look at the rates of every disease that smallpox essentially is eradicated in Pennsylvania by 1914. Diphtheria has dipped down, if you're treated with antitoxins, dipping down to a 5 or a 4% death rate. And you can just go through the list of these great successes. And then these crazy Europeans decide that they want to sacrifice an entire generation of their sons in Flanders Field. And long before we go into the war in April of 1917, and I say this all the time, if you color-coded the American population between 1914 and 1918, that population moves east and it moves north. And in Pennsylvania, by September of 1914, the British have an order in for 2 million shell casings from Westinghouse out in Pittsburgh. And so all of our industrial enterprises, the towns that are wrapped around them, the cities that are wrapped around them, are swelling. So by 1917, with everything giving way to the war effort, you're seeing what must have just been an absolutely sickening decline in the health of Pennsylvanians. We have an outbreak of smallpox amongst rural African Americans from the South who have moved into Pittsburgh. So smallpox is back in a big way. Diphtheria is going up. Scabies, which is generally a disease that human beings don't acquire. If you do, you're in a rural area and you're getting the mites from sheep or other domesticated animals. Well, all of a sudden, scabies explodes in Philadelphia. You have hundreds of cases of scabies in Philadelphia. You're forgetting to even attempt to help sanitary situation in any of our cities or towns. And he's watching a rollback of all of his efforts since 1905. He's been prey to a while. They'll call it anemia, and it may very well have been pernicious anemia. So he goes to the hospital of the University of Pennsylvania in September, October 1917. He has his secretary, I can't remember his name, but his secretary essentially moves into the room next to him so that he can continue working as commissioner of the Department of Health. He's given whole blood transfusions to try to get him to a state where he can recover his strength. By February of 1918, I think he knows it's all over. There is enough time to put in a phone call to Black Rock Farm. His wife and daughter, who doesn't marry until after her father passes away, are able to motor into HUP, and they're there at his bedside when he dies in February of 1918. And, you know, it may be also one of these, it's not to be callous, but, you know, Horatio Nelson, the great British admiral, you know, he probably died at just the right moment. He dies in the midst of his greatest victory, and he doesn't have decades to screw up his reputation. And General Patton may have done the same thing. A peacetime Patton was probably something that would have been detestable to people. Instead, he dies shortly after the war. Dixon, if he had lived another 7 months, would have been confronted with the influenza pandemic. And under wartime conditions, he may have done a better job of getting compliance from Pittsburgh, just because Dixon is a respected individual and his opinion carries a hell of a lot of weight. But the acting commissioner of health, Benjamin Franklin Royer, is confronted with a situation that is almost uncontrollable because of wartime considerations. He drops the greatest efforts against an epidemic in Pennsylvania's history. But Pennsylvania still has 67,000 dead at a minimum by the end of the pandemic. And most of those deaths are going to fall in the age range of 18 to 45. And so, though it's sad and he sees a rollback of much of his efforts, I think the greatest disappointment would have come in the fall and winter of 1918, 1919, when he would have been confronted with a disease that may have tarnished his reputation. If there's any silver lining in this man dying in the midst of his work and at the sad time in his work, that may have been it. But he dies of, it seems, anemia in February of 1918.
Great, thank you. Another question we had is, researching their family tree, the death certificate of their paternal great-grandmother notes she died in Kensington in August 1907 of typhoid fever. Have you come across a typhoid fever epidemic in Philadelphia in 1907?
So Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Inquirer and the New York Times described the drinking water of Philadelphia during the late 19th and early 20th century, because it all comes from the Schuylkill River, right? After it flows 100 miles through Reading and all these other towns and farmers' fields, just before it's taken into the distribution pipes, it's described in the papers as a coffee-colored stinking mess that only a few mud-loving catfish are able to survive in. And so Philadelphia at times will have epidemics or outbreaks of typhoid. The way typhoid works is, unlike, say, measles or smallpox, you acquire it once and you've got lifetime immunity. Typhoid gives short-term kind of conditional immunity to people, which is why people aren't walking around with typhoid all the time in the 19th century. And Philadelphia will clean up its water supply by the end of the first decade, beginning of the second decade of the 20th century, including adding chlorine to the mix. But what the questioner has probably seen is what you see year after year in Philadelphia, about 23 deaths per 100,000 people. So dozens of deaths every year that are quantified as typhoid, plenty more that aren't quantified as typhoid. And their relative probably took in either city water or water from a privately dug well. Those privately dug wells tend to end in Philadelphia, where they tap into the water, the groundwater. And there are plenty of photographs in HSP and elsewhere where you can see the hand pump to bring your water up, and it is standing flush against the outhouse. So you dump your bowel contents into the water in your backyard and you pump it back up into your drinking water, into your drinking glass. And that's probably what they're looking at. It's not probably an outbreak. It's not probably an epidemic. It is probably just the run-of-the-mill typhoid that kills scores of people in Philadelphia every year. And Philadelphia gets a bad rap because historians have tended to compare it to New York, which is like 100 miles away. And New York has very clean water coming in from the Catskills. Remember that number 23 per 100,000, because if you cross the state to the city that people in Philadelphia don't really recognize, and that's Pittsburgh, they have a rate of 144 per 100,000, making it the worst large city in the entire Western world for typhoid.
Wow. It's
yeah, it's awful.
It's
awful. I love Pittsburgh, but Pittsburgh at one time was the worst place to live in a major urban area. And that includes Birmingham, Manchester, Chicago. Nobody holds a candle to Pittsburgh and the dying that goes on out there from infectious disease.
Wow. Another kind of general question was, what year was the Pennsylvania State Health Commission finally formed?
So if you're looking at the Pennsylvania Department of Health, the legislation is written in 1903 by Charles Penrose. Penrose, who is brother of Boyce Penrose, who is the longtime state Republican political boss, takes over. Kind of the succession we have is when Matt Quay dies, he becomes political boss, and he's a senator until the early 1920s. And so Charles seems to have gotten promises from his brother that there's not going to be any undermining of this law in the legislature. And so the law is passed in 1905. Governor Pennypacker, his other two credits are the founding of the Pennsylvania State Police and the anti-cartoon law, where you're not allowed to depict politicians as ashtrays and beer mugs. He was offended that the Philadelphia Inquirer had a cartoonist that had done that to him. And so by April of 1905, Pennypacker has settled on Dixon, but Dixon also makes a number of he presents a number of ultimatums. One, I get to pick everyone. You don't get to pick anyone, and neither do any of your politicians. It's just going to be me picking doctors and scientists. But number two, he will not step down from the Academy of Natural Sciences. So he's president from 1895 until his death in 1918. And in fact, the Pennsylvania Department of Health runs one of its primary offices out of the Academy of Natural Sciences for years. And when Dixon says that he's in Philadelphia working, it means he's at the Academy doing the work of the Academy and the state. So 1905 is your year for the real Department of Public Health that has teeth behind it. The Department of Health, by the way, when we're looking today, I mean, all you have to do is look at HSP and the way Dixon runs things. When people were either praising Secretary of Health Levine or cursing her over the last year and saying, well, where does she and where did Governor Wolf get the power? 1905, it's written into the law. Those laws, just a couple of tweaks were done to update them in the 20th century. But the laws that are put into place in 1905 are the laws that allowed Levine to have the power that she had in Pennsylvania over the economy and schools and churches and everything else. It's that original 1905 law, which is why Dixon was picked, because Pennypacker is afraid you get the wrong guy in here and he is going to run roughshod over people's rights. And so I want to get a guy in who's not going to do that. And at the same time, we'll have a strong department. Within 2 years, the Journal of the American Medical Association recognizes Pennsylvania State Department of Health as the strongest and the best organized in the entire country. And Dixon himself runs the largest anti-tuberculosis fight on the planet between 1906, 1907, and 1918.
Wow. No, that's interesting. I mean, it's directly connected to to what happened, as you said, what happened in the current pandemic.
Absolutely,
that's fantastic. Looks like we have one last question. They just had a question about aside from HSP, what other archives did you use to in your research for public health?
So the other seminal ones, we're looking at Philadelphia. Okay. The Philadelphia archives at 1300 Spring Street, I think it is. So the Philadelphia archives are very good. I warn you before you go in. So they're good for the annual reports of City of Philadelphia Department of Public Health and Charities, and before that was the Board of Health. They're great for looking at the records of Philadelphia General Hospital, which is Blockley. Now it's in University of Pennsylvania's campus, kind of where the Barbara Bates building is. Or I call it the Barbara Bates building.
Is that the city archives?
Yeah, the city archives. Yeah. Is it 1301? 3001.
Yeah, they moved now. I don't remember the exact address. Okay. They recently moved.
Just give yourself, if you're going in to do it there, it is not, like HSP, in that I don't think that I've ever waited for more than maybe 10 to 15 minutes for documents. And I can be kind of the archivist's worst nightmare. I go in and I ask for documents, and I'm talking about, boxes and boxes and boxes, I've never had anything but kind words, and probably, talking about me behind the stacks. My God, what does this guy want? But if you're going to the city archives, give yourself time, because the last time I researched there, it's been a few years. It can take time, and if you have one person that's out, as happened to me the last time I was there, your research trip can be spoiled. So you want to do the kind of legwork first on the phone or computer to make sure the right people are there. That's important. If we're expanding out beyond Philadelphia, then the State Archives in Harrisburg is very good. The county archives at Lehigh County are excellent in the public health and medical holdings that they have. The Western Pennsylvania Historical Society, which is the Heinz History Center in Pittsburgh, very, very good. Academy of Natural Sciences has some material that's related to Dixon, but I'll tell you, a great, it's just kind of a great, almost straight line, very easy to go from HSP, is the Barbara Bates Center for the History of Nursing in the nursing school building at University of Penn. Their files are absolutely extraordinary, and I'm biased. Dr. Bates, she's passed many years now, but her book Bargaining for Health, or Bargaining for Life, it's one of the touchstone secondary sources I've used, and their reading room is dedicated to her. Whether you're looking at private or public city nursing, the Westar Institute, a lot of records from University of Penn hospitals that have kind of found their way in there, the visiting aid societies, social services that are considered public health then, but you really wouldn't consider public health now. That's at the Bates Center too. Again, one of those, rather like HSP in that you don't wait long, but you want to have your ducks lined up before you go. And I can't remember the library fee. It's like HSP. It's not very much at all. Those are the primary ones for public health that I've used in Philadelphia itself.
Great. Thank you, Jim.
Sure.
And I just wanted to thank one of our viewers, Sandy Hewlett, mentioned that the city archives are now at 6th and Spring Garden. And,
6th and Spring Garden. Okay, I think it was 3001 at one time, but
yeah, it was. It was on it was on 30th and Market, something like that.
Okay.
They moved to 6th and Spring Garden, and I guess you can make appointments for research now.
Okay.
And I think that's all our questions for tonight. Jim, again, I want to say thank you for a really, really interesting and wonderful presentation, and for being here tonight.
Thank you so much.
And I want to thank our audience as well. We did record the program, so I will be putting it up on our website, and I'll be sending out a link to everyone in case they want to go back and look at it again.